Okay, in this series, we're going to start to look at myth and legends of different people, outlying people, what some people might consider primitives and so on, but people of different statures. One of the ones that I like very much is ancient Amerindians and the Indians and the tales and folklore that they had. My father was very enamored with the Old West, and I thought it to be strange whenever I was a kid because he was an Air Force flyman and everything, and to be enamored on that. But when the West was won and shows would come on, and he would be locked, and always was reading books and Louis L'Amour and things like that, and some of them had folklore and tales in them and stuff. He told me about a few of them. I even read a few of the series of books for it, and I liked it. Um, they made a movie out of one of them, and it starred, oh God, Magnum PA, Tom Selleck. And he had the book series too, where Sam Elliott narrated it, and there was a part where Wilford Brimley narrated it, and about the Old West and everything. And I ended up getting enamored with it. And of course, I've talked before, if you've seen it in my other videos, about getting into Dungeons and Dragons when I was a kid. And so I used this folklore book that I had gotten to try to use for, ways and quests people could go on, and different things, tales, and try to make it something different than you perhaps have heard before. There's a princess in a cottage and blah, 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 and tried to make it into something much more interesting than that, and try to weave a tale into it somehow that had something to do with ancient folklore. And quite often it would be a tribe that they would run into somehow on a quest for something. They were in this one town, and they would go, and then they would run into a lot smaller of a town, outlying type thing or whatever. And then going from there, they would run into people that were much more primitive, and hear about a tale of so and so on the way to try to doing things. And depending on how they worked it out, whether or not they got extra information or maybe even a scout that helped them, all kinds of different information. And I would have them sit at a campfire at night, the first night, blah blah blah, and they would hear this tale, and so on, and blah blah blah, and maybe they would get some information out of this, while talking to elders and stuff, and tribal crap and everything. And I did three or four in a episode that was real cool. I made a total different land that they had to go to from the elfin type of land that everybody is in D&D and type of things, and they had to go through this portal thing to hook up with Merlin type of guy and go to a different land. And this ended up being like America, and it was kind of shaped exactly backwards, and people didn't catch it till way after even looking at the map. But it was kind of flipped even backwards, and I used it at the last global maximum and stuff, and water levels being low, and so the way it looked that way. And drew it on graph art, soaked it in tea, dried it up, rolled it up like a scroll, burnt the edges of it and stuff, sealed it with a piece of glass, handed it to him, blah blah blah. Anyhow, it was neat because I used Yellowstone as a giant caldera, but it was still active because it was back, in the ancient times, and so it had that, and had a undead dragon, and a lich lord that ran and flew on the undead dragon, and so on, and blah blah blah. But that was like the climax of it, and there was all these ancient people that were really taken out of Amerindian tales, and three or four things they had to do before they could even possibly take on this idea, because they were going to try to stop something, and to do it, they had to have certain things. And this is an easy way to side gesture, just like I'm side telling a story right now. Anyhow, I love the ancient tales that they had to go along with them, and ancient tales from around the world. They're quite interesting, and you can see how they fit into their cultures sometimes. What we're going to look at is their original tale on how the world was made, and these ancient tales that they had. Let's see if I can get this to load right. A slightly different tale and version, because this is from a researcher from back when, of Catherine Berry Judson in 1913. Now, this is referenced in the one that I have, but she apparently went off of one time she was told a tale, And quite often these tales will be told slightly different from each other, usually signifying a certain aspect or something, almost like an Aesop's fable. Okay? And let's see if I can get that in just a little bit better. And does that look good? Hopefully we catch all the words there. But I'm going to read it, basically. So she tells you, and I wish I could do an ancient Amerindian voice, and I can kind of do one, but I don't want to try to do it through this whole thing, and I think it would be somewhat disrespectful, but it would give it so much more flavor if it was written and done in such a way. But let's begin. The earth is a great floating island in a sea of water. At each of the four corners, there's a cord hanging down from the sky. The sky is of solid rock. When the world grows old and worn out, the cords will break, and then the earth will sink down into the ocean. Everything will be water again, and all the people will be dead. The Indians are much afraid of this. And I want to tell you now to see if you can find an ancient type of connection that goes with floods and the four corners and pillars of the earth that you hear that eventually evolved into the biblical stories. For the Sumerians and other people had this concept, and the Proto-Indo-Europeans now, they had extreme contact with the people that came into the Americas. And while they show that they still had a swastika and all these things, perhaps these tales and these ideas come from an old, long time ago. For this comes from a time when people would leave their bodies out in daises and let birds eat them and take them into the skies, and buzzards and vultures. And we've seen a lot of that symbology, Göbekli Tepe and all these type of things that go down, but all the way through Egypt and this vulture concept. And I recently did one about a vulture bone flute that's 40,000 years old. And we see that lion animism around that same time. And these same people that apparently had a lot of symbology and a lot of naturism going on with it. And I think it's neat to look at. But also whenever you see a tale and you start to hear things like this, and this is, of course, pre-contact, they're ancient tales, and so it shows you that even though it's pre-contract, I know we live under the same sky, but for you to come up with something so matching it somewhat, that shows something. I've seen this exact first portion here told on why you don't leave a bow strung when you're not fighting. What are you talking about? Well, if you leave a bowstring back then in the way they used to make them, of course, it would eventually become lax and stretch out, and then when you try to pull it, it could break real easy. So once you made a good taut bowstring, then you would untach it in between usage. You wouldn't leave it going all the time and day in and day out. It wasn't made of nylon and so on, right? So it was just some way of telling this, but this cord will eventually break and blah, blah, blah. And they would be telling this maybe when they were showing a kid how to put it over his knee and bend down and string a bow. But tell you also at the same time an allegory about the way things have always been, kind of, so you should just catch in, if you will. Now, they tell you another set of stories that go along with the creation of it, and what you see in this strange tale is a time before time, almost like the Aborigines of Australia concept, in this thing that happened like a big flood and destruction and so on, but there was this time before time, or this golden age, if you will, that a lot of the Caucasians over in the old world still had going on in this concept of time. But look and see if this doesn't catch more coincidences. In the long time ago, when everything was all water, all the animals lived up above in Gulan Ladi, beyond the stone arch that made up the sky. So people lived in heaven. But it was very much crowded. All the animals wanted more room. The animals began to wonder what was below the water, and at last the beaver's grandchild, the little water beetle, offered to go and find out. The water beetle darted in every direction over the surface of the water, but it could find no place to rest. Before I go on, I want to read that again to you, but I want to preface it again. Think of this as a people that used to live across the Bering Ice Bridge, and that over there it started to become crowded. They felt pushed, and in a time that they could make it, animals were all going across here, and so they followed them. In the long time ago, when everything was all water, all the animals lived up above in Gunalatl, beyond the stone arch that made up the sky. But it was very much crowded. All the animals wanted more room, and the animals began to wonder what was below the water. And at last the beaver's grandchild, little water beaver, offered to go out and find out. The water beetle darted in every direction over the surface of the water, but it could find no place to rest. Back then they already had boats, so they were going and working off of ice shelves back and forth, but then at a certain time they could maybe go across. And again, we have a beetle symbology. Egypt has a beetle symbology with a dung beetle and how it rolls up a ball like the earth and then springs forth life too. There's this odd concept. I guess I should do a separate video about that. I did one that talks about it extensively about 4 years ago now. But so in this tale, like many of them, there's no land at all, and it's all flooded in a primordial flood. And let's see what it says. There was no land at all. Then the water beetle dived from the to the bottom of the water and brought up some soft mud. This began to grow and spread out on every side until it became the island, which we call Earth. Afterwards, this earth was fastened to the sky with these 4 cords, but no one remembers who did this. It's just kind of strange. I'm going to leave that open for a second. At first, the earth was flat and soft and wet. The animals were anxious to get down, and they sent out different birds to see if it was yet dry, like in Noah. But there was no place to alight, so the birds came back to Gunalatl. Then at last it seemed to be time again, and they sent out Buzzard. They told him to go and make ready for them. This was the great Buzzard, the father of all buzzards we see now. And ironically, one of the times of telling of this, and it's actually a tribal elder, old Indian, dressed in his get-up, sitting by a campfire, telling a story that I've seen before in video. A man describes a condor and how big he is, and it's like the Thunderbird. And what is strange about that is I should do one separate about Thunderbirds, and it'll have this attachment back to what I'm talking about now. It'll have that web attachment, but these people have this Thunderbird concept and this rebirth that happens out of this thing that controls, and when it flies by, it makes a crackling noise. Now, what's strange about that is now today, when I was a kid, and being an Air Force brat's son and everything like I talked about, there were the Thunderbirds, and there were a specialized flight group, and they came to where we were quite often and worked out of it part of the time, but they worked out of it also mainly and had a whole air base that was really in New Mexico. But not these areas. These Indians we're talking about are up in Tennessee, in Kentucky, in the hills there, in Appalachian, perhaps in the area off of that. But isn't it interesting that we have this tale of the earth was too wet, they sent out birds and they had to come back and blah, blah, blah. Then now in some of these tales, they sent out a raven, but he never came back. But the raven was greedy, and he would take things and steal things from you to try to woo his own women and ideas. And you see that idea in these things that a raven does and everything, and they put it into there on some tales, and some tales they didn't. I'm going to break in right here and tell you another tale that this same video had in it, where this guy talked about that there was the golden days, and what they would do was that they lived in a different place over the hills and far away from there, and it was set up to where it was the end of the valley, and they would come down into the valley for the winter for shelter and to hunt for food, and that they would go around some way, like around this one way, and all the bison would show up and they would chase them back into this valley, but it was a cul-de-sac and they didn't have a way out, and then they would just camp and feed off of them. But one time there was a real bad winter, and it showed up because one of the ones they caught was the great white buffalo, and he brought a frost winter upon them that was devastating, and then the buffalo didn't come back again after that. So they moved to where they are now. And he goes, man, well, there's no buffalo at all here. And it's kind of like, well, that's not a connected story, but oh, okay. You know, it's kind of like that. So let's continue here. Now you look at this hills of North Carolina and Tennessee and the Newfoundland Gap area and everything. So this is in 2012 when the trees are just starting to change and there's a few orange highlights in it. Man, it's gorgeous area. He flew all over the earth, low down near the ground. This great buzzard, this thunder bird. And he flew down low near the ground, and it was still soft. When he reached the Cherokee country, he was very tired. His wings began to flap and strike the ground, and he came too close to the ground, kind of an Icarus, kind of a Phaethon type of thing, but he came close to the ground, and wherever they struck the earth, there was a valley created, and wherever the wings turned upwards again, there would be flicked up mountains. So when the animals above, in the heavens, in the zodiac, and in heaven, saw this, they were afraid that the whole world would be mountains, and so they called him back. But the Cherokee country remains full of mountains to this day, and that's one of the reasons that they live in the mountains. And you go, well, that, okay, well, it's just your attachment to this. And this was their original home in, like, North Carolina and Tennessee. So when the earth was dry from the beating of his wings, but there was still not dried up totally, okay? So when the earth was dry and the animals came down, it was still dark. Therefore they got the sun and set it in a track to go every day across the island from east to west. Now they called the Americas an island, probably because they came into it through a little peninsula, right? So they go, man, this is a big old island we ran into right here off the edge of this one little thing that apparently doesn't exist anymore. Once the ice went through that next phase, perhaps they saw that and went on, and they somehow have this disconnected island feeling, right? So it went every day across the island from east to west, just overhead, but it was too hot this way. Red crawfish had his shell scorched a bright red so that his meat was spoiled. Therefore the Cherokee would not eat it. And you can hear tales around the world where, like, that's the reason people are tanned so much in an area, and it burnt their skin, or that's the reason that there's deserts there, is the sun came too close. And so they changed the sun and they brought it up a different direction, or they changed the whole direction of everything. Well, that really seems to correlate more with when the winter and we're tilted and when the summer and we're tilted. And I don't know if you know or not, but that's the oscillation that changes on what happens and when deserts get attacked more, and then it goes to green Sahara and those type of ideas. But other things trigger on that too. But red crawfish, therefore the Cherokee do not eat it. Well, crawdads, I hunted for them when I was a kid, but it was bacon in the water and everything. I grew up in Texas, okay? So we had all kinds of fun down in creeks and things. Even caught a Texas cichlid before, all the way there. So, Carpentus. Anyhow, we would have these different ones, and there were different markings too on each one, and occasionally they would be colored up a lot, and you could tell that was usually a male. They'd have bigger claws and everything, but it was nowhere near red like a lobster. But if you cook them, then they turn that way. So it's strange that they mention them being so red, because if you've ever had crawdads, just like lobsters, you cook them and they turn red like that. Now, there's a story about all medicines, everything too, and maybe I'll get onto that in another story. But then the medicine men raised the sun a hand's breadth in the air, but it was still too hot. Now, this is a hand's reach, but also this might have an ideal on summer and winter and when the sun's coming across here and coming across there. But let's continue. Still too hot. They raised it another time, and then another time, and at last they raised it 7 hands' breadths, so that it was just under the sky arch. Then it was right, and they left it so. That is why the medicine men called the high place the 7th height, or the most high. Every day the sun goes along under this arch, and on the underside it returns at night on the upper side of the arch to its starting place. Now, I don't know if you know, but the Bible talks about us pretty much living in a snow globe, and that there's a firmament above. And it seems like it's taken from the Sumerian tale. And what's strange about that, I see in one of the Sumerian tales talking about going to the four corners of the earth, and that above its firmament and below its firmament, but in the middle it's not. And there's another tale where he kind of gives an inclination like this whenever he's supposedly taken up into the sky, and he becomes real scared and can't look down, and oh no, and then he looks down and sees everything turn like little ants. And it's weird. Well, you can imagine somebody seeing something like that from a mountaintop, and then in their mind picturing it and so on. But a lot of people use that for a UFO idea of things. But when you get up there at a certain point, the earth is white on the top and bottom and so on, and there really isn't a glass firmament. But maybe it would be explained that way to somebody about how the atmosphere is held around. But it wouldn't be glass or tin, and it wouldn't have holes in it that lets the sun or lets the rain in, for that would mean that the space is made out of rain and water, and that's an incorrect ideal. But they kind of have that same idea. And also that the sun and the moon are the same size pretty much, and they're inside of this arch or this dome that's there, right? The arch over them. Isn't that strange that they would have that same concept of in the 4 pillars of the 4 cords that are holding them up, and that people used to be, well, so ancient aliens have used this, I'm sure, but people used to be up in space, and they came down here when everything was cool after this great catastrophe happened. And in the Sumerians, they kind of tell a story where they're taken up into heaven and watch the catastrophe happen and then set back upon earth. And that's just strange as hell. But then also they have the flood story and letting the birds loose and the nowhere to land and coming back. And where does that come from? Because the Bible people aren't really, they're wandering around in the desert and so on. They're not, definitely not seamen and maritime people, but it's a maritime thing to take certain birds and release them, and if they come back, you're nowhere near land. If you release one and then he never comes back, you know which way he went, and you follow that bird. And this is something that a lot of people know. And then, of course, this augury that the Greeks used to do, and declamation of things and of seasons, and of course when the ducks fly home and the swallows return to Capistrano, right? Anyhow, so the sun goes to these arches and through these mountain deals and comes back, and it resets itself, and that sounds so much like Egypt and like the Sumerian ideal and told in the ancient Gilgamesh tales and so on, and what a lot of people have going on, except for we know they knew of a round earth. This wasn't really like a snow globe, but they had this ideal of the bubble over us, like a bubble on a pond of water, and we were inside of that on a floating piece of cork. And God could dunk that cork at any time, so straighten up. Really, in essence, they had this tale that there's now, see if this to you either means they know of South America, they know of the other side of the world and a people that live there, or if this is talking about a subterranean world, for people use it in all three ways. There's another world under this earth, like this one in every way. The animals, the plants, and the people are the same, but the seasons are different. The streams that come down from the mountains are the trails by which we reach this underworld. Past the equator? The springs at their head are the doorways by which we enter it. But in order to enter the other world, one must fast, and then go to the water, and have one of the underground people for a guide, so a local guide. We know that the seasons in the underground world are different because the water in the spring is always warmer in the winter than the air is in this world, and in summer the water is cooler. Now, of course, if mountain runoff water and, the mountain rocky springs and all this type of thing you're talking about, and of course it would be cooler while it's almost winter and things, but see the weird correlation, how that just simply could be underworld. When they talk about underworld, a lot of times in elder tales it seems to be in Egypt, in Yemen, off Bahrain someplace, in lower India, and the underworld. And you look at the equator where it passes, and it's at that point, and these people are living more where the sun reaches its highest point and pivots down past that. Yeah, and they get a Tropic of Capricorn, if you will, Tropic of Cancer situation. But so much of land is, of course, northern hemisphere, but there is a southern hemisphere. And so is he talking about caverns, or is he talking about a different world, or is he even talking about on the other side? But their seasons are different, so then either he's zigzagging to a southern hemisphere from north, and to me it's always seemed to have been, aren't they just talking about South America? Because, when it's Christmas here, it's summer there, right? And I remember, I got told that when I was, I was less than 10 years old. And then whenever this topic came up, within my teens and stuff, and I was like, boom, that's what I see it like. We do not know who made the first plants and animals, the Cherokees say, but when they were first made, they were told to watch and keep awake for 7 nights. And this is strange. It has to do with Gilgamesh and his tale whenever he finally showed up at the edge of the earth and was asked to stay awake for 7 nights or so on, and he had to do so. If he could, then he could be immortal. But when they were told to watch up and keep awake for 7 nights. This is the way young men do now when they fast and they pray to their medicine. Oh, so that actually has something to do with the rituals. They tried to do this. The first night, nearly all the animals stayed awake. The next night, several of them dropped to sleep. The third night, still more went to sleep. At last, on the 7th night, only the owl, the panther, and 1 or 2 or more were still awake. Therefore to these were given the power to see in the dark, to go about as if they were in day, and to kill and eat the birds and animals which must sleep during the night. And in this you can see a tale of why certain animals are nocturnal and things go on, but how they couldn't stay awake. And while there's all this different forms of mortality and morality, right? But have you ever tried to stay asleep? Well, sure, when you were younger, you could stay awake all night and the next day, but the next night, man, you were ragged. If you try to make it more than that, and you don't have meth or something, you're in trouble, right? And then, okay, so let's just pretend somebody had something or no-dos or whatever. You might make it through another day, but there's no way. You'll literally just start to die, man. You can't stay awake like that. So And but then they say that the gods are immortal, they never sleep, and so on. But they do rest sometimes after they're tired after doing something, and then that shows you the non-omniscience of the situation. Even the God of the Bible rests on the seventh day, and it's like, oh, people made that into where he didn't quite make it, and so that's just why the world is incomplete. In some tellings, yes, but that's lost in an idea too. Let's continue. Here's a tale about trees and evergreens. Even some of the trees went to sleep. Only the cedar, the pine, and the spruce, and the holly, and the laurel were awake all 7 nights. Therefore they were always green. They are always sacred trees. But to the other trees it was said, because you do not stay awake, therefore you shall lose your hair every winter. And of course, this is leaves. And in one of the telling I get told, they'll become bald. And it's like, well, Indians really grow out well hair and they don't become bald. So what is this ideal on? Well, it's the trees. They go bald in the winter. And see that it's a flavor of the way you say something. It's a slang in a way, but it works off nature. But strange they would have that slang whenever they don't really go bald. Oh, sure, Indians sometimes thin on the top, but you don't go around seeing dish bowl head, Greek balding, spot-looking Indians in any way, shape, or form. I've seen lots of Indians that have full, long ponytails, like Willie Nelson, more than somebody that was balding. Let's continue. But there's the evergreens and situations. Also, amazingly, one of the most sacred trees in many Indians is the sycamore, and that is just like what you see in Egypt and so on, and the yew tree and oak and so on too, but they couldn't quite make it. They went to sleep the night before. After the plants and animals, men began to come to the earth. At first there was only one man and one woman. He hit her with a fish. In 7 days a little child came down to the earth. So people came to the earth. They came so rapidly that for a time it seemed as though the earth could not hold them all. And they're not gonna, I thought she finished it, or I wouldn't have gone to this. I would have done another one. So they couldn't hold them all. So they ended up starting to overpopulate the earth, and this was going to piss off the gods and everything and put things out of issue. So he changed it, apparently God, that women could only have a child once per year, it said. And another telling says 9 full moons. But then, of course, you don't have a child, you don't get pregnant again within a full moon of having a child, but usually 1 or 2, 3 after, and then we start getting on the idea of a year. Still, quite interesting, and you can hopefully see some type of parallels, because I definitely do, but I was trying to do comparative versions whenever I was doing my studies on this. And of course, if you knew the other stories that I know that's from like Altaish lands and even the Scandinavians, so this northern Arctic thing that was going on, and then if you just jack it all the way out to the east and run it up over the Kamchatka Peninsula and past the Sea of Okhotsk, and you run it right into Alaska and into the Americas. And they seem to have held a lot of these stories that go along with it. And I found it very interesting that it still had to do with the sacred bird. Now, oh, by the way, there were no Andean condor types whatsoever, except for on California, on the coast, really, at the time that they were telling this tale. But that was the bird. It's bigger than a buzzard. It's the king of all buzzards. And he's trying to explain to them like it doesn't exist anymore. And they're like, yeah, it kind of looks like this. It's got a ring on its neck and so on. And they're like, yeah, that's it. You know about the thunderbird or whatever. But it seemed to have been the same ideal of a thunderbird. And then that raven idea. But no, the buzzard and the vulture, if you will. And because he eats dead and carrion and flies way up into the sky, like Cygnus, and the constellation of the bird that so many of these burial mounds point to, and directly to the east for the sun to come up again, to rise with the next setting sun, and these primordial concepts that are almost like a primordial womb, and laying them on a fetal position, and red ochre burials, all this that went together. It's quite amazing to go over it sometimes. If you like, I can go on to more of this. This was the legend of how the world was made, but if I simply back it up here, we have also the eagle's revenge, the very first fire, and how they got that. The pheasant that beat corn, medicines, according to the Cherokee legend, and I was going to talk about that, but I didn't want to go off in left field on a whole nother branch. The origin of simple strawberries, but it's got a neat tale in it. Two wolves, while the turkey gobbles, and there's many proverbs and stuff and things that go along with this, but there's a lot more than this. This is like, what, 8? And in my one book over here, it's thick looking like a Bible, and it has probably a whole chapter on this, and it goes over much more than what even is listed here, and just some of the things they tell. Some of them seem outlandish and so on, but you can also, what I wish they would have done is give you at least an Aesop's fable idea. If you were to ask the Indian, well, what am I supposed to learn from this? And then they tell you, and you put that right below it, but they don't do that. They leave it up to the reader. And you have to read a lot of them, and you have to get into an ancient wilderness, type of person's mentality and stuff to even probably grasp the concepts they're going with. It doesn't have anything to do with the modern world that you're thinking in your mind. Go camping for a couple of weeks and you might start to reach it, or at least do that in your mind. And that's what I try to do whenever I go into these. Anyhow, so it's quite interesting, but something like this, where you'd be telling the story to other people about the ancient time and everything and where it originally came from. And I think it's interesting part of humanity, definitely. And we'll go into some more of these. And if you'd like to hear more on Cherokee and Amerindian tales, and maybe a lot of connected material that goes along with that, let me know in the comments down below. Like, share, and subscribe, and enjoy. Peace.